One of the greatest economists in our lifetime is the focus of a new documentary and the subject of a new book by Jason Riley. We sat down with him recently to talk about the life and influence of Dr. Thomas Sowell, who has literally shaped conservative economic and political thinking for 5 decades. Sowell is a living legend in economic thought and has allowed the truth and the facts to shape his thinking. Hold on and buckle up. Jason Riley joins the Standing for Freedom podcast starting now. Hi, welcome to another exciting podcast here on the campus of Liberty University. I'm joined today by Jason Riley, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a Fox News commentator. He is also the director behind the more recent documentary on Thomas Sowell, Common Sense in a Senseless World. He's the author of an upcoming biography, Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. Jason, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much.
Hey,
thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, and you are an astute observer of many things, not the least of which Thomas Sowell, who is an intellectual giant in economics and certainly in conservatism. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about his life, biography, why it is that you came to really focus on him for, 2 decades, 3 decades even?
Well, I first learned about Thomas Sowell in college, so this would have been in the early 1990s. I was working on the school paper and having a conversation with some colleagues about affirmative action.
Yeah.
And one of them said to me, Jason, you sound like Thomas Sowell. And I said, Thomas who? And the person wrote down the name of a book on a sheet of paper. And I went to the library at school that day and checked it out and read it that evening in one sitting. And went back to the library the next day and checked out the rest of the library's Thomas Sowell collection, and have been hooked ever since.
Yeah.
So it's been a long time that I've been reading him. He's had a huge influence on my development intellectually, and was eager to do both the movie and the book about him at some point.
Well, by the way, what was the name of that book? Do you recall?
That book was called Civil Rights, Rhetoric versus Reality, and it's a book that was written on the 20th anniversary of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 30th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education ruling.
Yeah.
So Sowell was tackling both of those landmark decisions.
Well, I tell you, Sowell has become a regular read in my household. We are a family that homeschools. My wife and I both have numerous of his books and have read them through the years. I went to seminary about 10 years ago, and when I was looking at social gospel, I was looking at Black liberation theology, the social justice movement. I read quite a bit of Thomas Sowell, and what I found is that though he was not a theologian in the theology proper, he oftentimes had a better understanding of human anthropology, the human condition, and understood in many ways the limitations of government and the limitations of people. And so when you think about the theology of man, what is in the nature of man, I think Thomas Sowell is an excellent writer and in many ways better than many theologians out there.
Yeah. He's
Mm-hmm.
written quite a bit about human nature and political philosophy,
Yeah.
and traced our differing political philosophies back hundreds of years, not only in this country but also in Europe. His specialty is the history of economic thought and the history of ideas. But he has traced these political disputes that we've had in this country back a long, long ways. And in fact, some of his own favorite books among the ones he's written deal just with this. Books like A Conflict of Visions and The Quest for Cosmic Justice. Those are books that talk about human nature and political philosophy, and he's tracing it all the way back to people like William Godwin
Hmm.
in the 17th century, and saying that our disputes today about social justice and equality that now come under the banner of wokeness and so forth,
Mm.
those are very old debates that have been going on for a very long time, and Tom is a student of that history. Yes.
Yeah, the other one is Vision of the Anointed is one that I came to enjoy. And what was interesting is that when it came out in I believe it was the 90s, 96 or 97 was the first publication.
Yeah.
Um, you would have thought that he was prophetically speaking of the Obama administration in 2008. Everything that he wrote about there, of course, he was writing in a historical way, but he was also looking forward in a way. It was almost like George Orwell's own prophecy, and it came to fruition much
Yeah.
later. Um, Tell me this: when you obviously you are a teacher in your own right. You write for the Wall Street Journal. You've written your own book, I think, in 2014. What was the title of that one that came out?
The 2014 book was called "Please Stop Helping Us."
Yes, yes.
Yes.
How has soul been instrumental in your own writing, your own thinking, kind of in your own philosophy?
Well, I think it goes back to that first book I read,
Hmm.
uh, Civil Rights Rhetoric versus Reality, which was really a critique of the civil rights vision
Mm.
of the world
Mm.
and how best to help disadvantaged groups, namely blacks. And Sowell is an empiricist. He's someone who wants to look at the facts and the data and follow them to their logical conclusion,
Mm.
which also makes him a bit of a historian when it comes to writing about some of these things as well. And I just appreciated the way he went through the facts and the history. And he said, with a lot of these policies being promoted to help blacks and other groups, you have to look not at what the intentions are of the policy. The
Mm-hmm.
intentions could be the best in the world, but you have to look at what's actually happened in
Mm.
the wake of these policies being put in place. And I also appreciated that he took a view not just of what has happened here in the US when it comes to these policies, but he takes an international look at these things,
Yeah.
down history, and I really appreciated that. He thinks outside of the box in that sense, and he's just really fearless in his honesty, his
Mm.
intellectual honesty in reporting these results. He's not going to change them or sugarcoat them to fit something more politically correct
Mm.
or to tell people what they want to hear.
Mm.
He's gonna tell it like it is, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak. And I sort of appreciated his willingness to do that,
Yeah.
and that it should be something that we expect of all of our scholars and intellectuals to simply follow the facts where they lead. But that's not what happens. You have people out there who are very concerned about being politically correct in their findings or having fashionable views
Mm.
and so forth, or being popular,
Yeah.
and that trumps the truth
Yeah.
often. And that's not how Soul goes about his work, and I really appreciated that, and it's something I've tried to emulate in my own journalism
Yeah.
over the years, simply following the facts where they lead and reporting them.
That's so well put. Empiricism is the observance of natural law and things that are working out over time. And what is so interesting, and it even starts out in your documentary, where he says that oftentimes it is the socialist and even the social justice types that preach a message that is often, or speak a message, proclaim a message that is often a vision of reality that looks better than oftentimes what conservatives will say. But it's so much of what actually doesn't exist. I think it was Ronald Reagan that said once, it's not that liberalism or liberals are dumb, it's that they know so much that is not so. And it's an ideology. It's really an ideology in search of not truth or meaning, but really of apt pupils that will buy into that ideology rather than, as you say, observe and search the facts and let the facts lead them to the truth.
Right, and Soul I think he lays this out most cogently in his book, A Conflict of Visions, where he
Mm,
writes again about human nature. And he says that there are really two major visions that people have, and he calls one the constrained vision and one the unconstrained
mm,
vision. And they don't perfectly align with a political party or political philosophy, but they mostly do.
mm,
And Sowell looks at the unconstrained vision as one that just assumes everything is possible,
mhm,
that there are no constraints in life. Everybody can have everything in equal amounts,
mhm,
and he says that's just not the way the world works.
mhm,
But if you approach public policy with that view, it's going to lead you to believe certain things
mhm,
about what is possible. And then he contrasts that with this constrained vision or this tragic vision of human nature, where he says there are constraints and there are trade offs. And giving, spent time and money and resources spent doing one thing means fewer time and less resources to do something else.
mm.
And Stoll clearly takes the more tragic view, the more constrained view, as do many conservatives. But that's sort of how he has laid it out in his scholarship
Mm.
over the years, and I think he's absolutely right about that.
You know, the Western tradition, Western civilization follows Augustine of Hippo's, even his construction of man, largely. That being of original sin, understanding that we're fallen in a fallen world, and by nature, the noetic effects of sin are that we are not rational human beings, rational creatures, and given over to our own proclivities, there's just a natural downgrade in society. And you fast forward, it comes down to other theologians like Aquinas, and he wrote quite extensively on Aristotle. And it seems as though there is a realist perspective that needs to be reintroduced into society. And I think the constrained vision is exactly that. It is a realist perspective. St. Augustine had his own sort of economic axiom that he put forth, which was the mother's dilemma. Every household has to decide, based on limited resourcing, how they're going to provide and feed and clothe their children. That's every mother's dilemma. And so the reality, and I think what you point out in the documentary with Thomas Sowell, is that he understands trade-offs. Everything has a consequence. If you pay for it in this area, it's going to cost you in another area. And so many people want to say, many politicians don't live in that reality. They just want to promise without any expense. It's all about expediency.
Yeah, yeah, you're right, and I think that this view that he's laid out continues to be extremely relevant
Mm.
to our discussions today. More recently, we've been talking about a federal minimum wage
Yeah.
of $15 an hour, and some people say, well, that's one way to address poverty. You simply give everyone a raise, whereas others would say, well, there's going to be a trade-off here. Yes, if you have a job
Mm,
and you make minimum wage, you'll get a raise, but other people will never get hired in the first place because it's suddenly become too expensive to hire them.
mm,
And the best poverty program is a job.
yeah.
So, are you really addressing poverty when you raise the minimum wage and price certain individuals out of the labor market? And so, yes, that is the sort of Sowellian way of looking at the world. That there are trade-offs here. When you want to do one thing, you have to think about other consequences that may happen after you put that policy in place.
Amen. Well, let me ask you this: was there anything in the last couple of years that you learned that you were surprised by Thomas Sowell? And typically, when you do a biography and you uncover and you spend thousands of hours of research and then interview, was there anything that surprised you that you didn't know about him?
Well, I've been following him for quite some time, and I've been a pretty close reader of his work. But I do know some things that I think might surprise a lot of people about Soul. And one is how late a start he got.
Yeah.
Soul didn't uh, get a college degree until he was 28 years old.
Mm,
Um, he didn't publish his first book until he was 40. So you look at how prolific he has been, and you think if he had had the more traditional trajectory career-wise of your typical scholar or academic, how much more prolific he would have been. But Sowell got a very, very late start. He was a high school dropout. In
Mm,
fact, he never earned a high school degree. He later got his GED. But he did a stint in the Marines during the Korean War. So he's had a very circuitous route to where he is today, and it's a very, very interesting story that I try and get into both in the documentary as well as in the book, and it might surprise people.
that's great. I think there are people who might be listening to this and think, wow, there's still a chance it's not too late. that's that's awesome. And I think he came to Hoover, what, in his 50s. Is that correct? The Hoover
He
Institute?
was 50. It was 1980.
Oh,
He was
so
already 50 years old when he started at Hoover. Yeah.
awesome.
He spent the 60s as a college professor mostly, moving around from school to school. And I think he really wanted to be a college professor. That's how he wanted to spend his career. But the 60s, academia was really changing. You had anti war movements, you had civil rights movements, women's movements, and so forth. And the whole idea of a higher education, a college education, what it was supposed to be about, what was expected of the kids, what was expected of the adults, all that was changing. And when the campuses got radicalized, I think it really pushed Tom away. And it came to a head for him when he was teaching at Cornell
Mm,
in the late 60s when they had the riots on campus. And I think that was really the beginning of the end of Tom's career as a professor. But he has continued to teach through
mm.
his columns and through his books over the years, most of which are written, for non-academics, for
Yes.
non-intellectuals. And he has spent a career sort of continuing to be a professor in that regard through those books and columns.
And I would say that's well worth his time. And an encouragement to many of the academics who are out there is to write in a way that it not only can be helpful or beneficial to some, but might be read and understood widely by many. And I think that trajectory is what we should all aim to do. And he's done that marvelously through the years.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, Jason. Here at Liberty University, we educate kids. We're training kids for tomorrow, and a lot of times, this again is under the rubric, under the lens of the Christian worldview. What would your challenge be? Through your extensive writings and your research, not only of Thomas Sowell as a figure, but of many others. What would your encouragement or challenge be to young students, young people, as they are starting out in their not only an academic career, but then also in their jobs, vocational work?
Well, I think as I travel around and do some speaking on college campuses, what I'm increasingly troubled by is the level of intolerance for other points of view. And what I encourage young people to do is to hear other people out, debate people, understand where they are coming from, rather than try and silence your critics or keep other people from hearing their point of view. And college campuses today seem to be getting increasingly more intolerant, and I
Mm,
find that very disturbing. I think college should be a place where you go to sharpen your critical thinking skills and you learn the difference between a slogan and an argument, for
mm,
example.
mm,
And today, unfortunately, and often with the help of administrators, people who bring a contrarian point of view, an unorthodox point of view, are they're tried to people try to silence them or keep them off campus or keep them from having access. And Tom is a good example of that. Someone who uh, uh, had a very strong point of view early in life. He was a Marxist
mhm.
growing up through his 20s. He was still a Marxist, even after going to the University of Chicago and
Yeah.
studying under Milton Friedman. Tom
Yes.
Sowell was still a Marxist, but he always kept an open mind. He was reading William F. Buckley. He was reading Burke.
Mm,
He was reading those guys, even if he didn't take to it. At
yeah.
least back then, he was reading them, and he kept an open mind about it. And when he did decide to change his views after working in government,
Yeah.
he learned he came to appreciate what the free market could do versus what socialism would do or what Marxism would do. But he always kept an open mind, and I wish young people today would be encouraged to do the same thing. And unfortunately, we see it not only on campuses but in the media, at major newspapers. This debate over whether people can handle another point of view or whether they need to be spoon-fed. This one unique way of looking at a matter. I find that very troubling.
Yeah, the cancel culture has spilled over, and I would even say it's not only influencing those on the left. I even think it influences some on the right as well. And the classic liberalism, that even Frederick A. Hayek had advocated for, was this idea that you should have a space where a plurality of ideas can take root and can take shape. And the traditional university used to be the place for that. But it is so ideologically driven these days that unless you are speaking in lockstep with everybody else, I mean, it's almost like a new form of fascism in education, that you have to hold to the perennial doctrines and ideologies of those on the left, or you're canceled. Yeah. So, as far as the upcoming book, when are we to expect that, Maverick?
That will be out May 25th, and it is available to be pre-ordered on Amazon now. It's called Maverick: A Biography of Thomas Sowell. I've been working on it for a number of years. Sowell was very generous with his time.
Yeah.
For interviews for the book, so I interviewed Sowell as well as a bunch of his colleagues and friends and people who are acquainted with his work over the years. And it's really a more of an intellectual biography that focuses on his ideas, on his scholarship, where he's made his mark, how he'll be remembered, what his legacy will be, and so forth. And I round that out with talking about his life story as well. So you get a little bit of both.
All right, fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to that. The title is Maverick: A Biography of Thomas Sowell, coming out May 25th. Jason Riley, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.